Hello and welcome to the Genetics Podcast. I'm your host, Patrick Short. My background is in population genomics and studying the genetic causes of rare disease. I did my PhD at the Sanger Institute in the University of Cambridge and have been in biotech since 2018 when I started Sonogenetics. Sonogenetics helps academic and industry researchers to run large-scale genetic testing programs that speed up their clinical trials, generate data sets for the next big breakthrough, and give participants the best possible experience taking part in research. Each episode of the Genetics Podcast, we bring you insights from the leading minds in genetics and precision medicine, including household names and Nobel Prize winners, as well as early career scientists and biotechs working on the next big breakthrough. Whether you are a scientist, entrepreneur, executive, patient advocate, or simply someone curious about how genetics shapes our world, you're in the right place. Thank you for listening, and let's get started. Welcome, everyone, to the Genetics Podcast. I'm very excited to be here today with Dr. Madhuri Hedge, who's the SVP and Chief Scientific Officer of Revvity, which is a company that develops innovative technologies and services that advance research and solution in life sciences, diagnostics, and healthcare. Their focus across the genomic spectrum, including ultra-rapid whole genome sequencing for infants, I believe was one of the first, if not the first, institutions to offer clinical-grade whole genome sequencing in the US, let alone the world. And prior to joining Revvity, Madhuri was at Emory as well as a number of other organizations where she was really one of the pioneers in precision medicine from the very beginning, going back to defining ACMG guidelines and thinking through how some of these early impactful technologies will actually reach patients and families and have an impact. So we're going to have a far-ranging conversation today. And I'd just like to say thank you for taking the time to join us.
Thank you, Patrick.
I want to start a little bit with, let's start with Revvity. People are probably familiar with the company that Revvity was a couple of years ago, but you're a spun out, refreshed, rebranded company. I'd love if you could talk a little bit about what drew you there, what the company focuses on, so we can set the scene a little bit about what you're focused on today.
Sure. So Revvity was formally announced in May of 2023. And Revvity really stands for Rev as in revolution and Vita as in life. So that's the double V you see in the middle of our name. And Revvity really was, as you mentioned, the rebranded version of our former company, where we divested our food and applied markets business and then went on to become purely a diagnostics and life sciences company, very focused on healthcare. And it's been an exciting change for us because really it helped us focus on what we really have been doing for many years and then now take that further.
So if you could give people a sense of what the big, I guess, workhorses of the field over the last decade have been, clinical grade whole genome sequencing, other kinds of pieces. And then if you could contrast that a little bit to what you're excited about going forward. You've got interesting programs in newborn screening that are announced recently with Genomics England. You've got ultra-rapid whole genome sequencing in critically ill infants. Obviously, the clinical grade whole genome sequence is going to continue to be a major thing, but I'd love to hear about the last decade's themes for you and then what changes going forward.
Sure. So, as you mentioned, I truly I came from academia to industry, and I feel like I was at the right place at the right time because I got to see both sides of the world. Largely because, the technology has changed so much. I mean, since I sort of finished my PhD, went on to do my postdoc, and we were just in the world of Sanger sequencing for a very long time. Now, we all talk about sequencing a lot, but all the ancillary methods around sequencing, I must say right at the start, are still very important. They are still helping us figure out a lot of basic questions in science. So it is not just sequencing. But sequencing really transformed, right, from going from Sanger sequencing to next generation sequencing and what we were able to do in a clinical setting. And even research, a lot of my research has been based in neuromuscular conditions. And gene discovery was really facilitated by next generation sequencing. You see that steep rise from about 2006 to 2010 that where a large number of gene discoveries started happening and largely facilitated by next generation sequencing. So going on from there, we started with the short read sequencing and, we have all seen that evolve in the last 10 years, both in research and in clinical, the different applications of it. What has happened in the last, I think, 5 or 6 years is now we are starting to see this sort of availability of short read, but some different chemistries now, which are at our fingertips, that we are not depending on one single chemistry anymore. There are different chemistries we can bring to our labs now. That's one thing. And then the evolution of long read sequencing. Right now, we are still not there. For long read sequencing is making its way from research to clinical. And clinical is a little tough because we have to do a lot of validation. Even though they are laboratory developed tests, I must say that there's a significant amount of validation, analytical validation that is involved before
Yeah.
you can bring a test to the market and offer it to individuals to do it. And also, you got to get paid for the work you do. So that is still evolving. But I think right now, where we are is short read and long read kind of starting to run parallel with each other. And let's see how this evolves. So that's with like just the technology side of it. But again, as we all know that questions still remain. There are some certain conditions, like let's take the FSHD, uh, or some of the other methylation disorders, which really need some different methods to address it. And that's where optical genome mapping and methods like that have started becoming very important. And that's why I said, like, it's not just sequencing. We are starting to use a whole gamut of different methods in the clinical labs and even in research. And the last but not the least I want to mention is mass spec. As sequencing is sort of evolved over the number of years, I think mass spec has also come a long way. I'm a molecular geneticist by training, but it's just been an amazing experience for me in the last 5 or 6 years of my exposure to mass spec and how we can actually sort of start marrying these two data sets together. So that's where the field has gone in the last decade or so. Talking about just Revvity and what we are doing at Revvity. So, at Emory, I used to run the Emory Genetics lab. And at Emory Genetics, we used to get samples from all over the world. Coming here, I'm running labs in different countries now. So we have clinical labs in India, China, Sweden, UK, and US. So now you can just turn it on its head, right? Instead of getting samples here, we are now have local labs. So it's really been an amazing experience. So Revvity probably is the only company which has its own unique clinical laboratory network in its umbrella under the parent body of Revvity, which is truly a manufacturer of diagnostics and life sciences reagents and tools. But Revvity has been the global leader for newborn screening. We manufacture IVD kits and sell in about 110 countries.
Wow.
And
is that like blood spots, not whole genome sequencing? It's newborn heel prick blood spot type testing as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So just taking the dried blood spot card, every baby in the US, 4 million births in the US, they get the heel prick. But if you go to the hospital and, my daughter recently had a baby, the nurses will say it's a PKU test, right? It's only starting to change now that they say newborn screening.
Right.
But the PKU test or the heel prick has been done for a while. And there is this recommended universal screening panel, which is done in the US states and is actually referred globally as well. Now every state does it depending on its budget. Some states might do 10 and California does more than 50. So it really depends on the state and their own budgets. But it is so critical, right, that you save lives at birth if you detect early. And the concept is very clear that early detection, early intervention. And I think congenital hypothyroidism is a great example for it, right? If that thyroid pill is given to the baby as soon as the baby is identified, you're talking of literally a complete change in scenario where the baby may not survive to actually having and leading a normal life. So it's a huge deal, right? But think of countries like India, where there are like 26 million births compared to 4 million births in the US. And newborn screening is still not mandatory there. So we have still a long way to go globally when it comes to newborn screening. But personally, for me, I think coming here and sort of learning how newborn screening system actually works. And, when I came from Emory to Revvity, this was my opportunity really because around that time, we were starting to move from gene panels. Exomes were starting to become routine and people were just dabbling in whole genome sequencing.
Right.
So I used that opportunity to kind of start whole genome sequencing here. But I wanted to do it a little bit different, right? Because here now I have that infrastructure, if you can say that, where Revvity has a channel called ViaCord, where we do cord blood, cord tissue storage. So in the second or the third trimester, the parents are introduced to cord blood, cord tissue. At that time, if we talk to them about whole genome sequencing, then we are really talking of implementation science here. We see a lot of projects happening now for newborn babies, but if we really want to make it something which is more universal, introducing the parents to that concept very early on is important. And we published that paper in 2023 in JAMA of our early experience in launching this whole genome sequencing like that. And then we took it a little further, which was clinical whole genome sequencing. So really for sick individuals, babies, pediatric population, and adults, and also then doing the rapid NICU, which has also been an amazing experience, because if you can turn around those results that quickly, and we are doing it in 48 to 55 hours, you really can bring about change in how on the management of the, how the baby is being treated. But that's with whole genome sequencing. I think what has equally excited me, and I said this earlier, is the mass spec aspect of it. We starting to see that untargeted mass spec aspect coming to life now. A lot of whole genome newborn screening products are mass spec based. You're looking at one analyte at a time.
Right.
This concept of untargeted mass spec, eventually, I think as we go forward in the next decade or so, you're going to see sequencing evolve significantly. But alongside, I think mass spec is also going to come up at the same speed.
How does untargeted mass spec work exactly? What are you doing there?
You're really looking, think of de novo whole genome sequencing.
Yeah.
The closest analogy I can look at is de novo whole genome sequencing. You're looking at as almost similar way of doing mass spec as looking at analytes, and you're identifying new analytes or identifying those peaks, which might give you clue into the disorder, which might be still undiagnosed.
Yeah.
And there are some really good papers that are getting published now.
When you've talked through quite a few areas that are like where there's opportunity, and I'm interested to get your sense of where you think the biggest one is, because on the one hand, you've got, I guess, ultra rapid sequencing in infants that we know are sick, and a tiny fraction of the ones that probably should get that do get that today. The other frontier is screening in every newborn as early as possible, where you would, in theory, catch all of those, but you're also then sequencing everybody else at the same time and having to deal with the signal to noise challenges. And then you've got a related challenge, which is how much do you focus on? You could take something like a blood spot program and try to go to whole genome sequencing as quickly as possible. Or you could say, like you made the point earlier, in India, we've got 26 million people who still do not have access to the basic blood spotting that we have in the US. So actually, there's an opportunity there as well to just say, let's make sure PKU and other things get screened for. How do you think about these opportunities and which ones we go after first?
So I think just at a very fundamental level globally, I think what newborn screening, which has been around for now more than 60 years, has taught us is that Guthrie card, that we have really sort of got a sample type at our hand that we can actually use both for biochemical analysis, which is the current screening approach, and for DNA analysis or the molecular approach.
Yeah.
So now we have and also it is a sample type which is portable. And by that, I mean, it doesn't need to be frozen. It can be literally kept forever. So, at Revvity, we're really excited about this because we do whole genome sequencing on babies from DBS cards. And we've really honed this technique down, the sort of the expertise that comes within having labs and having the expertise that comes with these kits who are the people who are putting together these kits. It's amazing collaboration, right? So now you take that to sort of the next level of sort of a DBS card as your starting point. I think newborn sequencing definitely is kind of going to be the next and very important step. But we all have to think through this carefully. And I challenge this on probably every second, right?
Yeah.
We have a lot of very interesting projects going on, which are absolutely critical and important. I mean, we just, our lab in UK will be doing sequencing for the Generations project for Genomics England. We are doing sequencing for the RTI Early Check project in North Carolina. There are some other interesting projects going on in the country. These are the whole genome sequencing projects which are absolutely critical to move this field forward. So 2 or 3 ways to look at it, right? One is, the knowledge that we are going to gain from this whole genome sequencing projects. But we are also going to understand that which genes are critical to look at. And the fundamental problem of whole genome sequencing is how cheap can it become? Now, we
Right.
all have to think of this carefully. Today, whole newborn screening, it is a public health program. And it is not just the test, there is a whole system around it.
Right.
There is quality component around it. There have to be nurses who are going to do the sample collection. There has to be a follow-up.
Yeah.
I think what we are not doing well right now is to think of the newborn sequencing in a public health setting, what it would mean. And the reason I mentioned this is obviously cost is important. But aside from just whole genome sequencing being really cheap, its data storage is not that cheap. If you're sequencing, you're
Right.
storing the entire genome. So let's think of some practical solutions if we are going to deploy it globally. And I think a gene panel makes sense. But then the question is, how do you design a gene panel which is globally applicable? And we have been doing this exercise. We have been collecting all the gene panels. So even though all these groups are doing whole genome, they're actually looking at a subset of genes. They're not looking at the entire genome. So we've been collecting this data, and we have actually released a gene panel last year. We call it the NEO-NGS project, and that product is there. But we are now starting to dive deeper into really looking at the gene, the evidence, the incidence, should it be on a gene panel or not, and coming up with that gene panel, a baseline gene panel, which is globally applicable, which will help you control the cost, deploy it globally, and also, manage it in such a way that as discoveries happen, let's say in India, someone is doing it, but a genetic condition is so common in India, which is not common in the Western world,
Yep.
then you should be able to put it in there. So there's a lot of thought process that is going on. I think next 10 years, we are going to see that settle. Again, in that process, we continue to do this whole genome sequencing projects, learn from it. There are going to be some countries who will just deploy straight to whole genome because they can afford to do it. But when you talk about making it equitable, I think a gene panel makes sense if you're going to look at a global approach.
Yeah. What are you seeing on the sequencing price? Because we obviously saw this amazing curve for years, and then it kind of flattened out. There wasn't a ton of competition to Illumina, but over the last couple of years, there has been ferocious competition. And your question has me thinking about sometimes when you used to hear people say, there's going to be a day when it's so cheap to sequence a genome that we don't even worry about storing it. We just sequence it, we analyze it, we throw it away, and it's going to be like $1 to sequence, so sequence it again. But we have not turned out to live in that world. And I'm curious whether you see us getting back on that track towards the $10 genome or whatever it is, or if we're going to hover around a couple $100, because that seems to be where people can make it work.
Sure. So I think let's talk about data storage first, right? Because I've been thinking and thinking and thinking about this. And, I think it is better to store the DBS card and the DNA than actually storing the data. Even though we are storing the data right now, we don't discard data. But the best thing because the technology is evolving so much, that it's better to go back and resequence. I mean, every year we have a improvement. I think every 3 months there is new and improved chemistries launched by these companies. So it's better to resequence than to store, because that is quite an expensive exercise. Downloading, storing, archiving, and downloading the genome again is not cheap, right?
Yeah.
So I'm going in that direction. I think biobanking DNA is more a better exercise than actually storing the data. But again, you have to comply with all the global, every country has their own data security policies. And, there's a lot with that data privacy. So we have to comply with all of that. And that will continue to evolve. But if you talk of sequencing price, I think probably we are going to hover around that $50, $100 mark for a while. And I recently saw a presentation where they predicted by 2030, we will be at $10. But let's just think about it more practically, that it is not just about generating the sequence, right? There is so much that gets sort of built on when you are talking about sequencing. And what I mean by that is a company might provide a $10 or $100 genome, but you still have to do the prepping the sample, the library, there's labor that goes around it. A laboratory has to keep its lights on. So there
Yeah.
are those overheads that go along with it, and then interpretation. So I think we all have to get away from this mindset of $100 genome to what it means to do a complete genome. And by that, I mean from sample prep to interpretation and getting it out. And that price is going to look different from just doing that. What we talk about and what we hear about often is this $100 genome or $10 or whatever we want to call it. And I get very concerned with that, because what happens is when we are interacting, with
Right.
individual parties who want to do sequencing, they're so fixated on that
Yes.
$100 genome that they forget that there is this whole ecosystem that is needed around it.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It also always has me. I don't understand as much about all the things that happen on the sample prep side, and I think a lot of people don't. And then on the interpretation side, I understand a lot, and I simultaneously wonder why so much of that can't be compressed into software-driven interpretation that does become really cheap. But then you also have the human element on top of it of it's not 100% perfect. We need people to get in there and review. And as soon as you have doctors and clinical geneticists starting to get into review these things, and then you get out of the software costs that get it down to a couple dollars per sample and into this took a MD 30 minutes to figure out, and then you've blown up your $10 genome, right? Because then that's $100 easy.
I think interpretation of the genome is more like a science and an art to it, right? The science, like you can automate it as much as you want. And I think we are sort of on that track where the more and more variants that are classified are, deposited into public databases, such as the ClinVar, where, I find a variant, I automatically plug in that it is pathogenic or benign, and I don't have to worry about it. But that in reality, that's not how things happen, right? When a sample is actually sequenced and it comes to us, then, a lab director is looking at a number of things beyond just looking at the known pathogenic, not pathogenic. You have to look at the data set in its entirety. And I think that's where things get forgotten, because variant classification is still required, and it still requires human intervention. Probably 10, 20 years down the road, we would have sequenced so much, but you're still going to have those unique variants come up. And the last but not the least, and a very important piece, is that many times what happens is we could detect a variant that could be disease causing, but that disease does not exist in that individual just yet, or does not exist. And there are many cases like that, where, previously reported pathogenic variant, and we just don't see evidence of the clinical disease in the individual. And the more, healthy population we do, the more we are going to encounter these situations. So we still have a long way to go.
Yeah. On that note, I'm curious to get your perspective on how we think about data portability to newborn screening as these individuals become 16 or 18 or whatever the age is, where in theory the control over that would turn over. On the one hand, some people are thinking about how to solve that problem, but on the other hand, you said before, maybe we actually the technology is changing so quickly, we store the data and sequence later. I'm wondering if there's a world where we live in where we say, actually, newborn screening programs are not going to worry about that, because we're going to deal with the newborn things. And if you need a sequence again when you're 18, we're going to live in a different world then. I'm curious how you're thinking about that problem, because you probably get it a lot from your customers.
I hope that at some point there is a policy that gets put in place where, newborn sequencing programs do not need to store data, right? I think it's going to be very important that we sort of somehow get to that. And you're right. I mean, right now, as I mentioned to you, in our whole genome, healthy genome sequencing program, where families are signing up in their, second or third trimester, what happens is many times if they have older kids, they are getting their genomes done too.
Yeah.
Right. And this is not direct to consumer at all. We are going through a counseling service. There is pre-test counseling, there is post-test counseling, and the test is ordered by a physician.
Yeah.
But many of these, if these are kids, closer to 18 or 21, they can come back and ask for a reanalysis of the genome. And we have done that because where we have stored the data, we have downloaded the data, and we have gone and done the reanalysis. But it is an expensive exercise for the lab to do that. And I don't think we are really sort of, doing just justice to the amount of work we actually are having to put in right now with it. So that's where it stands today. But I really hope that as the technology is evolving so fast, there is some sort of a policy that comes that, we actually don't have to store the data. One small caveat to that, which is a very important caveat to remember, is that many times what happens is that people could challenge their results, that possibly a lab missed something.
Right.
And that becomes difficult because if you have dumped the data, then
Yes.
you have no recourse to it to go and checking anything. But that is a very rare occurrence, but it does happen.
Yeah, that's really interesting. The other aspect of it that I was thinking about was just I think that what is going to come out of these newborn screening programs is going to be incredibly useful from a basic genetic science perspective. You mentioned this earlier of the more population sequencing that we do where there's not ascertainment for we've sequenced all these people with cardiomyopathy or all these people with Parkinson's disease, and then tried to do some fancy stats to measure the penetrance. If you say we've sequenced newborn population and you follow those people their entire life, you're going to get a really good understanding of what lifetime penetrance. Some of these adult onset diseases not so good, but I think it's going to give us a really good sense of what the true population prevalence is of variants that we often only see in cross-sectional populations, right?
And it is very hard to grasp this concept of penetrance and expressivity too. I attend many patient advocacy groups meetings where a family of 4 siblings have got the same, genetic pathogenic event, but they are expressing the disease very differently. And it's
Right.
very hard for families to grasp it. Penetrance is even more difficult, right?
Yeah.
When you're talking of, let's take the example of LRRK2, the most common Ashkenazi Jewish mutation, the penetrance is from 15 to 80%.
Wow.
It's a very hard concept to explain to families because there's a lot that comes along with it. The emotional side of it is, and that's why the counseling piece is so important.
Yeah. Do you have any thoughts on how genetic counseling can be scaled? I had actually interviewed Holly PA from Early Check on a previous episode and also Wendy Chung from Guardian. I think in both cases we had some discussion about this, but we know already that we don't have enough genetic counselors in the community to service all the need that we have in the business as usual clinical genetics. If we start to layer in pre and post test counseling into newborn screening, we start to have a really big problem, right? If you want to have these conversations, but we may just not have enough people to do it justice across the board. I'm curious to get your perspective on that.
I think chatbots definitely have helped where you ask a question. And I had tried a couple of chatbots. They really kind of direct you in the sort of right direction, telling you, as you go on asking questions. But it really comes down to education. I don't think you can actually physically scale so much of genetic counseling because we all tend to forget that we are not machines and we are not robots. We need that human interaction. All of us need that. It's like having your annual checkup. You do want to see your doctor to ask questions. So I don't think you can sort of completely, make it a sort of a robotic type of an event. But there's a lot of education piece of it that can be done. Like what is autosomal dominant condition? What is a recessive condition? When you are doing a prenatal, you're going to find everything, So for example, when we do prenatal, sometimes we find non-paternity. But all that education is very important, right? From get-go, so that when you actually get into the session, you're coming to a little bit more of a level ground where you're able to explain the results more easily. Imagine doing this on. So one another thing to remember is that let's imagine a situation where 4 million babies are going to get newborn screening, right? A fraction of that are actually going into these sessions. Most of them, we are not going to have any significant finding.
Yeah.
That status is at age 21 and on when they reach their reproductive age and they can actually query it again. But very little is actually moving. So we have to think about this carefully, that what percent is actually moving in that direction.
Yeah.
And last but not the least, I think we all have to somehow figure out how we are going to marry the new clinical trials and therapeutic strategies that are getting developed back into this newborn sequencing system. Remember, newborn screening has the conditions right now. Many of them are inborn errors of metabolism, which are addressed right at the bedside, and they can be sort of physicians can take action on it. But let's take the example of Duchenne muscular dystrophy, which has been that application has gone in 2 or 3 times or not approved yet. There is a FDA approved kit for Duchenne. It's a CKMM kit, but you have to do molecular confirmation. The reason I mention that is because there are CRISPR-Cas9 strategies and a variety of different strategies that are being developed. It's also about figuring out how do you connect these individuals and these families to the right clinical trials or the right treatment strategies. Because you cannot expect the physician at the other end or the neonatologist to have it all figured out without giving them that information. And there are some amazing work done by many pharma companies right now in these type of conditions.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with that. It feels like a big opportunity to help those families, but also close the gap on the clinician side of I'm not a clinician, but I can imagine being in that situation where you have this incredibly rare result come through. You don't know the clinical trial landscape in a rare, ultra rare disease, and so being able to have some kind of network that allow everyone to just understand what the options are, right? Maybe a clinical trial isn't always the best option, but it's better to know and be able to make that decision than just not know, right?
Yes. And I'll tell you, like in many cases, families are very proactive. Like they will, sort of push harder in, I think the N. Lorem Foundation is one example. They're doing some amazing work, right? Where these families are pushing that envelope a little bit further so that they can actually, these treatments are getting developed. At the other end of the discovery work, and we interact a lot with the pharma industry right now. It's just very early discovery work, right? The drug discovery work I'm talking about, where biomarkers are getting identified. These biomarkers eventually can become companion diagnostic type assays when these strategies enter the clinical pipeline, because you need to monitor these individuals over probably their entire lifetime. So again, we're going back to that basic fundamental data of sequencing or a biochemical assay, which is a mass spec based assay, and taking that down to the entire sort of the life cycle of this product development.
I'm curious to get your perspective on proteomics and Olink in particular. Obviously, mass spec can be relevant in that context as well, but a lot of people see, especially at the population biobank level, are really excited about Olink. I'm curious to get your perspective on it.
Yeah, I think and Olink and a couple of other companies which are doing similar work. SomaLogics is also there. There are a couple of others now. I think it's really exciting. There was one paper that was published a couple of years ago doing the pQTL assays, showing that protein-protein interactions are not typically the way we think about it, meaning in a particular condition, a couple of interactions were identified, and then we kind of just lock that down, that protein interacts with that protein, and this is how it is. This particular publication actually showed that that same protein could be interacting in completely different conditions, which we have not even thought about. And they had some really amazing data. I think this is where these new technologies are going to be very important. I think the question really is, how do we translate the data that we are generating from these kind of technologies into a sort of a clinical perspective of how we are going to use that, right? Right now, we are using it in understanding just basic discovery work or basic understanding of protein-protein interactions or number of proteins that are there in a particular sort of sample. How do we take that a little bit further and bring it into clinical implementation? The way I look at it, I think right now where we are is in this implementation science. And how do we actually sort of enact on it is going to be very interesting to see, and how this unfolds.
I think that's a really good way to put it. And I wonder, are we in the same kind of spot for polygenic risk scores? Because it's been a ton of basic science research. I mean, one example that maybe you can comment on is the Early Check program in North Carolina is using a polygenic score for type 1 diabetes. I thought it was super cool the way they were applying that, but there aren't that many examples of polygenic risk scores being delivered in a clinically actionable way. I'm curious to get your perspective on that one as well.
So I'm really excited that, Early Check is doing that because they are the only program which has gone a little bit beyond than looking at standard monogenic conditions. And they have spent a lot of time curating that list of SNPs they are going to look at to derive those scores. Type 1 diabetes is interesting, right? So when you talk of type 1 diabetes, you're also talking of two types, the type 1A and type 1B. Type 1B has got a more of a inheritance component in it, which is a MODY type. So we are really talking of type 1A. And there is a drug on the market now, which is FDA approved, which can delay the onset of type 1A diabetes in kids, which is very important.
Right.
Those autoantibodies can be detected as early as 6 months. And the drug is given at about age 8, and it will delay the onset. It is like a 14-day infusion, and it can be repeated every 2 years, some similar algorithm like that. But now imagine taking it a little bit step further and marrying the genetic polygenic risk scores with that autoantibody data. I think this will be the first example where we would have shown that marrying these two data sets is actually going to help, at least delay the onset as much as possible. But that is just with, the type 1 diabetes. I think in breast cancer also, the polygenic risk scores have been shown to be effective. There are some very good publications on that. But it's just very early days for polygenic risk scores because we are all so spread. I mean, globally, and if you look at different populations and the pressures that come by being in a certain environment that change our gene expression and the exposure with that. So just having a polygenic risk score is probably not going to be enough because that risk score could change depending on where you live as well. Whether you live in Asia, Europe, the Americas, it could change. And how do you actually bring that closer together to create a clinical algorithm from it is going to be interesting. There are a lot of groups that are working on this and really some very cool work getting published right now, but it is still early days.
Yeah. As we wrap up here, you spent a lot of your career in academia, but you've spent the last couple of years in industry. I'm curious what you've learned as you've changed to a different part of the ecosystem.
Yeah, thank you for asking me that question. I've been here for 8 years now. So it's not a couple of years. And it's just been amazing. I mean, I feel I've learned so much. In academia, obviously, I wrote a lot of grants. I got funded for my work. And I was fortunate that I was running a clinical lab. So closer to the industry in an academic setting. So I was able to split my time. Coming here to see that, early stages of product development and how much work is put into R&D before a product comes to the market. I probably, when I was a researcher or running the clinical lab only, really did not have the real insight into the amount of work these companies put in. The KOL aspect of it, talking to people, fine-tuning that product, that requires an enormous amount of effort and investment before bringing that product to the market. I think I've just been really fortunate that I have had this opportunity to be here, right? And of course, them adjusting to me too, that I came from a purely academic setting, a little bit clinical, which is you can talk about it as commercial laboratory, but this has been a very exciting journey for me.
Yeah, amazing. Well, I just want to say thank you for sharing all the perspectives and insights today. If people want to keep track of your work or if there's anything that you're interested in people reaching out for, what would that be? Are you hiring? Are you looking for partners that are doing these kind of innovative newborn screening programs? What's most useful to you?
Yeah, I mean, I'm more than willing to talk to people and, people reaching out to me to discuss some novel ideas. And, nowadays, innovation and how you think about innovation is, innovation is not just a new product discovery, but there are a lot of different areas we can innovate in. And that's how I look at it. So really, willing to talk to people, reaching out, it'll be really exciting to, have that conversation continue.
Amazing. Well, I hope this sparks something interesting in some people listening. I get a lot of inspiration from listening to people like you speak on podcasts, but also going to conferences, spreading your wings a little bit and seeing what's out there. So thank you so much for sharing your work with us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thanks, everyone, and we'll see you next time. That wraps up this week's episode of the Genetics Podcast. I'd like to give a huge thank you to our guests for sharing their valuable insights and experience. And thank you as well to our listeners, as always, for tuning in. If you enjoyed today's talk, the number one thing I would really appreciate from you is if you could share it with a friend or colleague who you think would enjoy it as well. We would also really appreciate if you could subscribe to our show and give us a quick rate and review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast platform. Both of these things help us become more visible when people search for genetics and precision medicine podcasts. And we're always eager to hear from you. Please reach out to us with any questions or feedback on social media. You can find Sanogenetics on Twitter, LinkedIn, or visit sanogenetics.com. Finally, a big thank you to the team behind the scenes who make all this possible, in particular Amy Cousins and Sonia Shah who produced the show, and James Pierce from Selected Frequencies who handles the audio engineering. I'm Patrick Short, your host, and it's been a pleasure. Thank you, and we'll see you next time on the Genetics Podcast.